Hi, this is Scott Bradfield, and this is the latest episode of Reading Great Books in the Bathtub. We're taking a break this week from those big, doorstopper, monumental, modernist masterpieces such as Ulysses and the great comic novel by William Gaddis, Jr., and just doing a few one-shots, one-off lectures on different writers who I find interesting. This week I wanted to talk about a writer who many people probably don't know about, named Clark Ashton Smith. This is probably the only easily accessible volume of his short stories from Penguin Books. This is another excellent collection by Stephen Jones for the old Gallant series. If it's available secondhand, you should get this. But you should probably get them both if you're interested in this writer. And I just did a piece for him. I spent several months actually reading him much more closely than I ever thought I would for a piece for the Los Angeles Review of Books. At the bottom of this video, I will post a link to that piece in the LARB. And just say a few, again, as usual, extemporaneous remarks about this guy, who when I first read him off and on, he came onto my radar and off my radar over the decades. It was always in conjunction with H.P. Lovecraft. He and Lovecraft were quite close friends and kind of voluminous correspondence. They just wrote each other these endless letters, admiring one another and kind of keeping each other alive with admiration, because you can see these two guys who were kind of living in their isolated places, isolated homes, and they could use all the support they could get. And I've always found Lovecraft risible, just unreadable and just ridiculous. And I often would pick up Smith and feel the same way when I would just read little snatches of him. It was kind of the overwrought prose and the over torturous imagery, and you would just see this kind of everything was. I always thought of Lovecraft and the horror, and he would go on telling you how horrible things were until you just were laughing because nothing was that horrible except this terrible writing. So I had really negative feelings about Smith and picked up an interest in him mainly because he was a Californian writer. He was with Lovecraft and the famous Robert E. Howard, and kind of the amazingly talented Robert E. Howard, one of the three important writers to come out of Weird Tales, which was a pulp magazine in the 20s and 30s, that presented these three writers alone were worth the price of admission for that magazine. But it was a kind of fantasy and unusual magazine. They published lots of horror and very exotic type of stuff. Nothing you would really see around much anymore. I mean, George R. R. Martin's stuff has a little flavor of Clark Ashton Smith, but nowhere near as mossy and as rich as the Smith stories. So these types of stories and the peculiarity and the complexity of these visions are not comparable today. I can't think of anyone who really does this type of stuff this well. So that's a long way of getting to the point where I wanted to talk about Clark Ashton Smith. I read him kind of just gave myself a challenge. There were a couple of major books that came out about him. One is this beautiful book from Centipede Press, In the Realms of Mystery and Wonder, which presents a collection of his artwork, which I think is awfully fascinating, and then a lot of other interesting material as well. Smith was a Californian, born in Auburn, had very old parents. His parents were in their late 40s when he was born, and he spent most of his life taking care of his parents. He was an isolated guy. He lived off in this kind of cabin without electricity or running water. I want to give you a little picture of him. And he became connected with some of the San Francisco literary elite, such as Ambrose Bierce and George Sterling, the kind of fascinating character George Sterling, who wrote poetry and very exotic, erotic poetry at the time. Smith started off as a poet and a fairly interesting poet. Again, he was in a period of modernism when people were trying to write kind of visions of sort of the mundanity of life and make something beautiful out of that mundanity. That's a terrible description of modernism. But if you think about Ulysses, of going into the average day of an average man and turning into this monumental epic, you could see that there was a kind of exploration of what we knew, what we have, and what we experience in life. And Smith's interests were always in what we didn't experience and of going off the map of the world completely. So his stories are not even, they don't qualify to my mind as fantasy or science fiction, which they sometimes, which is where this is the label that sticks with Smith. They're more like an anti-modernist imaginary adventures into these weird exotic worlds, which are primarily language, because he writes this extremely rich, convoluted prose, which the first time you look at it sometimes looks horrible, often seems as overwrought as Lovecraft. But once you get into the stories, you start to realize that they're actually quite funny, and that Smith didn't take himself as seriously, I don't think, as Lovecraft, at least when he was writing. So Smith started off as a poet. He started to write these short stories, and he wrote about 100 of them over a period of a few years. And all the dates will be in the piece I give you a link to below, because I forget them all. He wrote them over a short period of time, and then he quit. The same way he quit poetry, he quit fiction, and he started doing these weird sculptures and paintings, some of which he was untrained in everything. He'd never learned anything. He lived off in these woods with a kind of a affected air. He walked around Auburn with like a beret on and stuff like this. He was a kind of a classic American oddball artiste. Here's, I think, some of these paintings. The glare may come off him. He reminds me a great deal of William Blake, and his interests and his kind of imaginary landscapes. So he has this extremely exotic eye, and you're thinking of this guy living in the sort of the middle of the most mundane part of California. It's basically cow country in the middle of Auburn, up near Sacramento. Never really left it. Spent his entire life there. Eventually became a kind of a site to visit by some of the great young writers. And many of the great young writers of that time who went on to become such important writers in the fields of fantasy and science fiction. Fritz Leiber, for example, and Harlan Ellison, and Henry Kuttner. So many of these writers loved this man's writing and would go off to meet him sometimes, or be interested in his work, or try to correspond with him. So I wanted to just read one little passage. I won't spend a long time on him today, just to suggest if you want to go out, you should really look at those two books I mentioned to you. I was so interested in his work that I actually went off and started spending a little too much money on a couple of first editions. This is one of his books that was published by the legendary Arkham House publishers, one of the first small publishers who came into existence almost entirely to publish Lovecraft and then Smith. Lovecraft quickly developed a cult following, but Smith's following has always been a lot smaller, and I think largely because he was not as big a correspondent, and his career didn't last as long as Lovecraft. Lovecraft he wrote letters to everybody endlessly, and Smith had a few correspondents, but he didn't have the range of friends and buddies that Lovecraft cultivated. I have to say that in reading the correspondence between Smith and Lovecraft, I like Lovecraft as a person. He's a really fascinating, weird character. I don't know that I'm going to be able to read him, but I might try him again someday. I wanted to read a short passage here, if I can find it, from the story I remember the best. And it's called The Abominations of Yonder. It's one of the very first stories he ever published. And one of the things interesting about Smith, and you'll see this in Lovecraft as well, is they had a few influences, and they were rigorous in their adoration of these writers. And the number one writer for both of them was Poe. And Edgar Allan Poe's, the rhythms and even the language from Poe's best stories and poems kind of infiltrates almost every paragraph of Smith. and often you'll see it showing up in Lovecraft. So let me just read a brief passage. These stories take place in the super far future of Earth or other planets, but totally exotic and kind of uncategorizable places. And the language is forcing you to imagine these worlds into existence, unlike modernism, which is trying to connect you to things you know or you can assimilate from the world around you. This is just the first two paragraphs of The Abominations of Yonder. The sand of the desert of Yonder is not as the sand of other deserts. For Yonder lies nearest of all to the world's rim, and strange winds, blowing from a gulf no astronomer may hope to fathom, have sown its ruinous fields with the gray dust of corroding planets, the black ashes of extinguished suns. The dark, orb-like mountains which rise from its wrinkled and pitted plain are not all its own, for some are fallen asteroids, half buried in that abysmal sand. Things have crept in from nether space, whose incursion is forbid by all the gods of all proper and well-ordered lands. But there are no such gods in Yonder, where live the hoary genii of stars abolished and decrepit demons left homeless by the destruction of antiquated hells. It was noon of a vernal day when I came forth from that interminable cactus forest in which the inquisitors of Ong had left me, and saw at my feet the gray beginnings of Yonder. I repeat, it was noon of a vernal day, but in that fantastic wood I had found no token or memory of spring, and the swollen, fulvous, dying, and half-rotting growths through which I had pushed my way were like no other cacti, but bore shapes of abomination, scarcely to be described. I'm going to leave it there, but you can hear, as a poet, the sense of the rhythm of the words and the complex rhythms of the words, which are almost like lines of poetry when you get through certain passages of it. I don't want to say too much more about this stuff because you can't really summarize Smith. I will say this, that for those of you who go back, and read the old classics of modernism over and over, like T.S. Eliot or Ezra Pound or even Hemingway or Virginia Woolf, they're wonderful. They're some talented writers and so forth. But next time you think of going back to read Alfred J. Prufrock again or something like that, put it aside and try somebody like Smith. He was doing something completely different from most of those classics who we are forced to read every week. And his stuff, I think, is as good as any of it, and certainly deserves our attention and rewards our attention. Okay, that's this week, and we'll do a couple more short pieces before we move on to some other monumental masterpiece. Bye.